Okinawa, April 1945. Rain pushed sideways in the Pacific wind fog, drifting low over broken coral ridges, and the ground itself looked burnt, pitted, torn. American Marines crouched low behind shattered tombstone markers of Okinawa's ancient cemetery ridgeline, waiting for the word to advance. Up ahead, the hillside was quiet, too quiet, because inside that mountain, inside that honeycomb of tunnels, were Japanese bunkers and firing ports that had been invisible all morning. The Marines already learned something brutal in these weeks. The Japanese on Okinawa did not occupy trenches like in Europe. They disappeared inside a volcanic hellscape. Invisible, heard but never seen. And every dark hole in that ridge could erupt machine gun fire at any second. This is why the flamethrower men were here. This is why the tanks carrying fire gel were moved to the front. Grenades could not reach those tunnels. Rifles could not reach those tunnels. Only flame could. And by April 1945, even the Japanese soldiers trapped inside those caves already knew it. Which is why, before the first American flamethrower even opened its nozzle, many Japanese voices from inside those caves began to scream in terror. Okinawa was not just another island. It was the final massive stepping stone to the home islands themselves. It was 340 miles from Kyushu, close enough that planners in Washington and in Pearl Harbor understood instantly. If Okinawa fell, the U.S. could launch B-29 strikes, fighter escorts, naval bombardments, and full invasion staging directly at Japan's mainland. Japan understood that too. That is why Okinawa was turned into a fortress of geology, not a fortress of surface positions. Because the Japanese High Command had already seen what happened on Tarawa in 1943, Saipan in 1944, Peleliu in late 1944, and Iwo Jima early in 1945. Every single time they tried to hold beaches, they were crushed. Every single time they tried to hold surface bunkers, naval guns and naval aviation incinerated them. So by Okinawa, the Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved into something else entirely. Underground war. The Japanese 32nd Army turned hills into labyrinths. They bored tunnels through limestone cliffs. They created hidden machine gun galleries that connected through rock. Caves that could withstand direct naval gunfire. Caves that could survive whole days of bombardment. Caves with multiple chambers extending like arteries 50, 80, sometimes over 100 meters deep. These were not foxholes. These were subterranean fortresses. The Americans saw the same thing on Peleliu. They saw it again on Iwo Jima. But Okinawa was worse, bigger, more mature, more deeply planned. It was cave warfare at continental scale. And this meant something extremely important from a tactical point of view. You could kill men in the first chamber and there were still 20, 30 more men deeper inside, which is why rifles and grenades were not enough, which is why demolition teams and flame teams became the spear tip. Because of the nature of flame, and because of the nature of napalm fire, behaved differently inside rock compared to open air. Inside, a tunnel flame did not just kill the man it touched. It sucked oxygen. It displaced breathable air. It turned enclosed rooms into furnaces. And it created instant psychological collapse. This is why U.S. Marines and U.S. Army flamethrower squads were not terror weapons. They were engineering solutions to a physics problem. This is important to say very clearly. American flamethrowers were not revenge weapons. They were the only workable method of clearing a tunnel complex where the defenders refused to surrender, refused to retreat, and had prepared to fight to the last breath. But something began happening on these islands, starting with Saipan, and then more clearly with Peleliu. Japanese soldiers began surrendering specifically when they heard flamethrowers approaching. They would not surrender to rifles. They would not surrender to grenades. They would not surrender to machine gun fire. But the moment flame teams and flame tanks rolled forward, that's when some Japanese soldiers finally accepted that they would rather live in captivity than burn in a cave. This pattern became more intense in Okinawa. Because Okinawa was the final crucible. This was the last fortress before mainland Japan. And as April turned into May 1945, the battle slowly shifted south deeper and deeper into prepared cave belts, where U.S. frontline units wrote in their diaries a common sentence repeated again and again: "Only flame gets them out," which now takes us into the deeper world situation and the reasons why both sides were psychologically locked into this final, tragic, underground collision. When Okinawa began on 1 April 1945, Americans expected another Tarawa. They expected beaches choked with fire. But instead the landings were quiet. The Japanese purposely allowed the U.S. to land almost unopposed, because the real battlefield was not the sand. It was the hills inland. The Japanese 32nd Army Commander General Mitsuru Ushijima had adopted General Kuribayashi's logic used on Iwo Jima: bleed the Americans inland from depth, not from the beach. So after the Marines and Army troops came ashore and pushed inland, they ran into defensive belts built into geological formations: Shuri Line, Conical Hill, Sugarloaf, Horseshoe Ridge, the Maeda Escarpment. These names became infamous because they were not just places, they were networks. Each one was a puzzle of rock and steel with tunnels linking dozens of firing points, all hidden, all pre-sighted, all mutually supporting. And here's the key. Every time one position was threatened, the Japanese could silently withdraw underground to the next chamber or sideways or down. They could appear suddenly behind the attackers. They could snipe from murder holes drilled through basalt. It was a defensive science, and this science was paired with another deeply ingrained doctrine: no surrender. This was not merely cultural pride. It was literal military regulation, field service code of the Imperial Japanese Army. Never live to experience disgrace as a prisoner. Captured Japanese diaries on Saipan and Peleliu described surrender as an agony worse than death, which meant a terrible paradox on Okinawa. When Americans approached a cave with rifles, the Japanese inside believed their own orders. Death was preferable. When Americans approached with grenades, Japanese defenders accepted the blast and held position. But when Americans rolled up flamethrower tanks, or when the infantry's M2 backpack flamethrower man stepped into position, Japanese defenders faced something different. Fire inside a sealed chamber was a death without honor, a death of suffocation, a death of screaming. Flame destroyed the entire justification structure of the no surrender code. That is why Okinawa contains dozens of field reports stating the same pattern. Flame used cave garrison surrendered. Flame teams forward enemy white flags from the side tunnel. Flame applied 19 prisoners emerged. This was not propaganda. This was combat psychology meeting physics. And this was also why the U.S. military continuously refined flamethrower doctrine from Tarawa to Okinawa like a technological arc. Tarawa taught them flame needed range. Saipan taught them flame needed coordinated infantry teams. Peleliu taught them flame needed specialized tanks. Iwo Jima taught them flame needed sustained logistics. By the time Okinawa occurred, the U.S. was fielding the true apex form: M2 portable flamethrowers in coordinated squads, POA CWS H1, Sherman flame tank napalm thickened mixtures, and in this final island, the Japanese defenders knew it. They had seen what had happened on Saipan and Peleliu. They knew what had happened on Iwo Jima. By Okinawa, the flame war was no longer experimental. It was perfect. This is the dark framework needed to understand why Japanese soldiers who had been ordered from birth to never surrender sometimes begged for mercy when they heard the churning pump of a flame unit approaching the cave mouth. The next phase now becomes necessary. How do we break this topic into the critical angles that explain this collision of psychology, engineering, and battlefield adaptation? Flame is not simply a hot liquid. It is a living chemical reaction consuming oxygen, creating heat, pushing shock expansion. In open air, a flamethrower jet looks dramatic, but its effects disperse. In a confined geological chamber, flame behaves like a bomb. When a burst of thickened napalm enters a limestone room, oxygen collapses, radiant heat spikes, and temperatures rise above survivable levels instantly. This is not cinematic exaggeration. This is pure thermodynamics, and U.S. Marine flamethrower specialists learned on Saipan, then Peleliu, then Iwo Jima, and perfected at Okinawa that 1 second of flame inside a sealed chamber was deadlier than a minute of rifle fire outside it. because enemy soldiers hiding in depth positions could not escape the blast radius. The napalm mixture clung to walls, to ceilings, to men. And a cave is a sealed metabolic system. Fire eats the oxygen humans need oxygen, and the defenders inside could die without a single bullet ever touching them. This is why flamethrower units were not cruelty weapons. They were engineering solutions to a mechanical problem. No other infantry tool could kill an enemy hiding behind 40 feet of rock. This is the cause and effect logic that triggered the psychological collapse. Japanese defenders understood exactly what flame meant inside those tunnels. Death by bullet still allowed honor. Death by flame was annihilation. They were not invincible monsters. They were some of the most vulnerable men in frontline infantry. Every Japanese unit knew, kill the flamethrower man first. He was literally carrying a fuel tank on his back. One bullet could turn him into an explosion, so the psychological war went both directions. The Americans who operated flamethrowers often felt time slowing down as they approached a cave mouth, counting seconds because their life expectancy was shorter than riflemen. Many flamethrower operators on Okinawa had watched earlier. Island veterans demonstrate the technique. Move under covering fire, crawl into position, wait until the defenders opened fire, then unleash the jet. They were specialists. The Marines who carried M2 Flamethrowers had to overcome weight, fear, and the knowledge that once they triggered the stream, every Japanese rifle in the area would triangulate toward them. This is why flame teams often included a rifle guard with 2 Marines, working as one carrying flame, one protecting him. Sherman flame tanks existed to reduce that risk, but tanks could not get everywhere. So the infantry flame man was still the point of the spear. And because flame changed the battlefield so dramatically, word spread among Japanese soldiers. Prisoners captured on Saipan told interrogators, "We fear flame more than guns." That sentence was repeated in different forms on Peleliu, and repeated again on Iwo Jima. And by Okinawa, the defenders had internalized this truth. Where flame goes, resistance collapses. Japanese doctrine was built around heroic death. A defender who died with his rifle in his hand was honored. A defender who surrendered was dishonored. But flame altered the meaning of death. Because death by flame was not samurai death. It was chaotic, suffocating, screaming, uncontrollable, without ceremony, without dignity. This broke the internal logic of the Japanese psychological code, which is why we have numerous recorded cases, especially on Okinawa. Japanese defenders signaled surrender only when the flamethrower teams approached. This was the singular moment when fear overcame cultural programming. American officers and NCOs wrote about it. They held until the flame came. Fire broke them. We took prisoners once the tanks caught fire. Flame was not simply a weapon. It was the trigger that forced a decision inside the cave. Do I die screaming? Or do I live as a prisoner? Even men who believed surrender was worse than death changed their calculus when flame units reached the cave mouth. And this dynamic, this collapse of doctrine under the pressure of physics, is why Okinawa became the most psychologically shocking island of the entire Pacific War. Because flame did not only kill. Flame changed minds. Island to island technological evolution. The American strategic understanding that flame was not tactical brutality but operational necessity. The flame tanks, the most feared vehicle of the Pacific War, Sherman tanks in Europe, faced Tigers and Panthers. Sherman tanks in the Pacific faced fortresses made of rock, which means the greatest tank killer in the Pacific was not a bigger tank, it was the terrain itself. The U.S. Marines and Army realized by mid-1944 that tanks with normal cannons could not break a cave. An armor-piercing shell might crack the stone around a tunnel. A high-explosive shell might collapse part of a wall. But neither could do what just one burst of flame could do. So engineers in Hawaii, in California, and at fleet anchorages in Ulithi and Saipan modified Shermans into flame tanks. The most famous on Okinawa, POA CWS H-1 Flame Shermans. They replaced the main gun with a flame projector that could shoot napalm over 100 yards. When those tanks rolled forward, the psychological effect on defenders was catastrophic. Men who had been willing to die against rifles and grenades ran from flame. On Okinawa, there are multiple recorded instances where Japanese defenders shot American riflemen with calm precision, but panicked when the flame Shermans lifted their nozzles. The flame tanks turned psychological dominance into a physical fact. Flame reached the untouchable. Flame entered the unkillable. Flame penetrated the rooms nobody could bomb or shell. And every cave mouth on Okinawa, whether it had seen flame before or not, carried the rumor that Americans now had a machine that could spray hell. When the Pacific War began, the U.S. infantry had flamethrowers but did not yet have doctrine. Tarawa showed flame could clear small bunkers. Saipan showed flame must be integrated into squads. Peleliu showed flame must counter cave depth. Iwo Jima showed flame must be sustained, not occasional. Piece by piece, the U.S. became the most advanced cave-clearing force in human history. By Okinawa, this was not improvisation anymore. This was an industrialized, protocol-driven engineering system. Flame was no longer a frontline curiosity. Flame was an operational necessity. Officers were trained to coordinate flame with explosives, engineers, tanks, and infantry. Flame was treated as logistics, fuel plus pressure plus napalm. Tunnel neutralization, it was the only reliable, energy-efficient, man-efficient way to convert a hill full of enemy soldiers into a hill that could be walked over by infantry without losing entire platoons. This is how flame moved from weapon to strategy. By the time Okinawa began, Nimitz, Buckner, Holland-Smith, and the Marine Corps flamethrower school instructors knew the psychological effect of flame exceeded its physical attributes. Enemy morale was not broken by bullets. Enemy morale could be broken by flame. This made flame a cognitive weapon. But here is the critical nuance: the Americans did not use flame as torture. They used flame as a faster path to surrender because they had spent the previous 2 years fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. Flame was the one tool that made the Japanese question the cost of continuing. And as a side effect, the flame reduced total American casualties, which is exactly why flame became the defining symbol of Okinawa's subterranean war. By mid-May 1945, the American advance on Okinawa had slowed to a crawl. The rain was now constant. The ground turned into clay soup. Every advance cost dozens of lives. Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, and adjacent positions had become the most murderous square mile of ground in the entire Pacific War. Marines wrote in letters and diaries, "This is worse than Peleliu." And it was, because Okinawa's southern ridges were not just hills, they were multi-level bunker complexes. On 17th of May, one of the critical breakdown moments finally arrived. American infantry had been stuck in front of a cave belt for days. Machine guns inside those caves had pinned down every attempt at movement. Mortars landed with terrifying precision. Snipers fired from holes nobody could see. Riflemen were exhausted. Grenadiers were out of grenades. The ground was so wet that demolition charges could not be reliably emplaced. They would slide down the mud slick before detonation, and then came the order: flame tanks forward. A platoon of Shermans modified into flame vehicles rolled up to the line. Infantry hugged the wet earth, waiting. Inside the caves, the Japanese defenders heard the grinding tracks. They heard the engines grow louder. They heard the mechanical whine of the flame pressure pumps. There was no way to stop what was coming. Not enough ammunition. No anti-tank guns left. No way to kill the tanks. When the Shermans stopped, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The tank commanders aligned their turrets. They did not fire cannon. They did not fire machine guns. They opened fire. A 100-yard jet of napalm roared into the first row of cave mouths. It was not a movie fireball. It was a pressure-driven column of sticky, boiling liquid fire. Inside the caves, there was no oxygen left in seconds. The shock was instant. Dozens of Japanese soldiers burst out of side exits, some with hands up, some screaming, some simply running, all of them making exactly the same decision: live. Because they could not die in a way they considered honorable inside those caves. And this was the moment recorded repeatedly by infantry officers when the pattern became undeniable. Japanese troops were choosing surrender specifically at the sight of flame. American riflemen, shocked, had to suddenly switch from kill mode to prisoner handling mode. One Marine corporal wrote later, "The gun didn't break them. The flame broke them." In those minutes, the battle lines moved. The positions that had been immovable for days collapsed in hours. And this is where the story must now continue, because this was only half of the turning point. The second half of the climax is darker, deeper, and more strategically violent. The Japanese high command now realized flame was destroying their doctrinal foundation, and they began launching suicidal night counterattacks and mass civilian coercion to compensate for the psychological collapse. Because when Japanese headquarters saw their forward cave belts collapsing under flame, when they received reports that men were surrendering instead of dying, they understood the deeper danger. Flame was not simply a weapon. Flame was a weapon that broke ideology. So the Japanese command began compensating the only way left to them, with forced fanaticism, with night infiltration, with mass banzai rushes in darkness, with civilians pressed into suicide tactics. There are military diaries from the 32nd Army complaining, not about American firepower, but specifically about American flame, destroying the will of defenders. So the Japanese attempted to restore that will through coercion. They ordered units to counterattack at night, not to win territory, but to restore warrior morale. Night after night, rain-blown darkness over the southern ridges exploded into sudden bursts of screaming assaults, men rushing at American lines with bayonets, grenades, satchel charges hoping to destroy flame tanks, hoping to kill flame operators. But here the Americans had already adapted. Flame tanks now slept inside tight infantry rings. Flame operators were protected like snipers, and every wasted counterattack only burned more Japanese manpower. Worse, the Japanese commanders began attempting to use the civilian population as a weapon. Civilians were threatened. If you surrender, you will be raped or tortured. Women were given grenades and told to kill their children and themselves rather than fall into American hands. This produced perhaps the darkest psychological tragedy of the entire Pacific War. Japanese soldiers were begging for mercy from flame while simultaneously forcing civilians into suicide to preserve the illusion of honor. Okinawa became not just a battlefield, but a psychological implosion. American flame tanks continued methodically clearing cave belts. American flamethrower infantry squads continued pushing south, chamber by chamber, and Japanese officers could not stop the collapse. By the end of May, General Ushijima knew the truth. The physical battlefield could not be saved because the mental battlefield had been lost. No doctrine in the world could survive a weapon that ignored cover-ignored fortifications, ignored bravery. When flame enters a tunnel, bravery does not matter. This is why Okinawa's final lines broke faster than expected, once the flame tanks reached the main Shuri defensive core. There are multiple U.S. after-action reports that say the same chilling sentence in different phrasing. Flame ended what guns could not. And this was the true turning point. Because if flame could break Okinawa, the last largest island fortress, then flame could break Japan itself. Which is why, in the final days of this battle, American planners and analysts, both Navy and Marine Corps, sent reports to Washington making a strategic argument. If we have to invade Kyushu or Honshu, we'll need even more flame tanks. We will need even more napalm refinement because flame is the shortest path through these tunnel belts. In a purely military sense, the U.S. was preparing to scale the Okinawa flame doctrine to the level of the home islands. But in July 1945, another weapon was tested in New Mexico, a weapon that would change the calculation again, and because of that weapon, the most terrible projected future of flame warfare was never executed on mainland Japan. But for the men on Okinawa in April-May, June 1945, flame was the final judge of whether a battlefield position lived or died. It was the final arbiter of surrender. It was the technology that made even the most indoctrinated soldiers accept captivity rather than annihilation. And that leads us to the consequences. When Okinawa finally ended in June 1945, the casualty tables looked like arithmetic from another planet. American dead, over 12,500. Japanese military dead, over 5,000. Japanese civilians, estimates between 100,000 and 150,000 dead. No island in the Pacific War produced numbers like that. But the internal distribution of those numbers is the real story. Most Japanese soldiers did not die charging at the beaches. Most Japanese soldiers did not die firing machine guns from trenches. Most Japanese soldiers died underground. They died in the cave systems they believed would keep them alive long enough to kill American attackers, and as the U.S. compiled after-action data, something emerged that was whispered in units since Palayu but proven statistically by Okinawa. Flame was responsible for the majority of cave neutralizations, not artillery, not naval guns, not riflemen, not grenades. Flamethrower teams and flame tanks accounted for the majority of final clears. There is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers report circulated privately in the months after Okinawa that concluded a sentence that was as cold as it was precise. Flame was the decisive weapon system for subterranean resistance. This sentence is not emotional. It is not moral. It is mathematical, because Okinawa was the largest cave fortress system in human war up to that moment, and only one technology consistently cracked it. Flame did not win the beaches. Flame did not win the air. Flame did not win the sea. Flame won the underground, and that victory changed American planning for the next phase of the war, because every single projection for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, assumed one thing. Japan's mainland would be one giant Okinawa, the ridges, the mountain belts, the tunnel systems, the suicide resistance, the engineered stoneworks, and American generals and planners, looking at the Okinawa data, came to a grim conclusion. If we invade Japan itself, we will need flame on a scale never before seen in human history. There were proposals, not fantasies, but actual staff proposals to build entire battalions of flame tanks. There were planning discussions to create mass production, facilities to deliver millions of gallons of napalm for the home islands, because the lesson of Okinawa was not fire winds. The lesson of Okinawa was flame is the only tool that can break a defender who refuses to surrender. And that lesson, if the war had continued into 1946, would have defined the future shape of Pacific ground combat. But history turned. A new shock. A greater shock changed the path. Okinawa's end reshaped more than maps and casualty lists. It reshaped planning, ethics, and memory. Operationally, the data from Okinawa fed straight into the contingency studies for Operation Downfall. Staff plans in mid-1945 no longer treated flamethrowers as a niche tool. They sketched whole task organizations, more flame tanks, dedicated napalm supply chains, flamethrower battalions paired with engineers and bulldozers to clear tunnel belts. Planners calculated fuel tonnages, pump spare parts, and protective measures for flamethrower crews. Their arithmetic was grim and utilitarian. Flame saved American lives at a terrible cost to the defenders. Multiply Okinawa by 10 and the material requirements became industrial. Politically, Okinawa's lessons were also urgent. The human cost of storming the home islands, now seen through the lens of subterranean resistance, hardened some voices in Washington for a faster, bloodless end. The flame doctrine, which emphasized forcible extraction of defenders from enclosed positions, became one of several stark inputs into the national debate in July 1945 about how, and at what price, the war should end. On the ground, there were immediate consequences for the men who had used flame. Flamethrower operators returned with complex memories. Many veterans described relief that their weapon shortened assaults and spared comrades. Others described moral disquiet. The sight of a cave emptied by flame, survivors stumbling out, civilians found in rupture and hysteria. Unit diaries record both dry operational notes and lines of private shame or gratitude. History remembers the role of flame in cold strategic terms. The men who carried the fuel tanks remembered heat and screaming, the close smell of burnt rock, and the heavy, practical knowledge that their work often meant fewer American graves. Across the Pacific and after the war, debates followed. Military professionals defended the use of flamethrowers as legitimate anti-fortification weapons, a tool to defeat hardened emplacements whose tactical function could not otherwise be neutralized without massive casualties. Ethicists and some members of the public asked harder questions about proportionality, about weapon effects on noncombatants, and about the psychological horror of death by fire. These conversations were neither tidy nor purely academic. They shaped post-war doctrine on urban and bunker warfare, and contributed to evolving law of war discussions in the coming decades. Technically, Okinawa accelerated innovation. Engineers refined napalm formulae, improved projector ranges, and developed better armored protection for operators. Tactics codified. Flame teams would always be paired with rifle guards and demolition squads. Tanks would operate in coordinated combined arms cells. But there was also an institutional memory. The weapon that had proved decisive against caves in 1945 did not become the centerpiece of future wars in the same way. The nature of conflict changed, and with it the prominence of specific tools. Yet the lessons about integrating engineering, physics, and psychology into combat operations, lessons learned in burning limestone on Okinawa, persisted in manuals and staff courses long after the last flame tank was decommissioned. For Okinawans, the aftermath was the slow unwinding of a civilian catastrophe. Towns that had sheltered in caves were left with scorched hillsides and grieving families. Memorials and local records preserve the terrible particularity of those months. The mixture of combatant deaths and coerced civilian suicides, the rubble of caverns, and the damaged psyche of communities. American units left letters and small tokens. Japanese survivors kept names and dates. Memory became layered, strategic victory and human ruin existing on the same ridgeline. Finally, the most immediate strategic consequence never had to be fully tested. The atomic bombings of August 1945 altered the calculus that Okinawa had driven home. The projected mass casualty figures for an invasion of Japan, the very figures that had prompted arguments for an even larger flame program, were never realized. The flame doctrine, forged in coral and lava on small Pacific islands, remained a potent wartime lesson, but did not define the post-war horizon in the way some planners had feared. The men who fought on Okinawa kept those images. The planners recorded the numbers. The historians debated the ethics. And history, having watched flame do what shells and bullets could not, now ask us to consider what those choices cost in human terms. War is often described in numbers: tonnage delivered, rounds fired, divisions committed, prisoners taken. But Okinawa leaves a different kind of record. It leaves a record of temperature, heat, the heat at which stone fractures, the heat at which earth liquefies, the heat at which the human body stops being a body and becomes evidence of what fire can do to a living thing trying to hide in the dark. The flamethrower was not invented to be cruel. It was invented to solve a tactical problem: defenders below ground and behind a layered fortification. The Pacific War, with its ridges, volcanic galleries, and fanatical last-stand cultures, turned that tactical solution into a defining instrument. What artillery could not reach, what bombs could not collapse, flame could force. When the war ended, America put the tool away. Cold War doctrine shifted to mobility, to nuclear deterrence, to precision air power. The Japanese army that had used caves, had used the terrain itself as a weapon, no longer existed. The flamethrower became a technical exhibit, a training anecdote, a line in the history books. It did not become a symbol of American identity. It became a symbol of a period in which war reached into holes and roots and hollows, into places human beings were not meant to fight. And what remains today is not a celebration. What remains is data. What remains is a warning. What remains is a sober reminder that the most effective tool in a tactical sense can also be the most psychologically scarring for those who see its effect up close. Okinawa is not a lesson in glory. It is a lesson in what overwhelming force looks like when terrain will combine to make annihilation the only option left to end a battle. The men who carried flamethrowers did not ask to become the instrument of that choice. They carried fuel because the terrain and the enemy's doctrine allowed no other practical way forward. And the caves they cleared still sit in that island's rock today, blackened streaks in limestone. A geology of memory. The war ended. The heat remains.